The past isn't over yet. It's constantly being revisited, rewritten, often edited and distorted, sometimes even weaponized. In this series, I talk with experts about how the past is mobilized today. We take Al-Andalus, the 8 centuries of Muslim rule over Iberia, as a starting point to explore how the present keeps returning to history, selecting certain stories, discarding others, and putting the past to work, and why that matters. I'm Cristina Moreno-Almeida, and this is Digital Al-Andalus on the record.
Identity changes over time. And so these sort of images get locked on to, well, this was a crusader who fought for us and fought for our nation. What is this imagined past? Is it the 1950s when the world was segregated and women did not have equal rights? This type of person who is going to not be content with the world that we live in and wants to restart history.
Today, I'm joined by Dr. Louie Dean Valencia, a historian and author whose work focuses on how young people create social change through technology, art, counterculture, social media, celebrity, and in public spheres. He has published books on history revisionism and the use of memory by the far-right movements, especially in Europe, as well as in the United States and Francoist Spain. Welcome, Louie, to our podcast.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Should we start by looking at how your work, at how the far-right groups manipulate history and memory, and what drew you to this field in particular?
So I guess I'll start with what drew me to the field and then kind of maybe explain that and that answer. So it was about 2019 or so, and I started coming across online sort of the ways that young people were using the internet more so to connect far-right actors. And I've always been interested in youth and the way that young people use technology to connect to each other and to promote their social ideas. So that I did some work in how anti-fascists in the 60s and 70s did that in Spain. And sort of this was kind of the opposite of that, how our far-right youth cultures using technologies to bring themselves together. And what I found was that a lot of young people were connecting to each other in really innovative and scary ways at the same time. And so I was studying particularly youth groups in Spain initially, but then I realized that they were networked together with groups in the United States and the UK and Austria and France, and really using each other's ideas to legitimate themselves. So, well, these people are they were all drawing on these ideas of the time was called generation identity.
Yeah.
So identity, identitarian ideologies.
I mean, it's still very
Still
relevant.
is, yeah, still very relevant. And really kind of the idea of it was trying to figure out how are they using these technologies. And during the pandemic, as we were all sort of stuck at home, I started noticing a trend that some of the people that I were following were going into Zoom classes of middle schoolers, so people that were 10, 11, 12, and inviting these far-right 20-year-olds into their classrooms to do really kind of horrendous sort of things, coming in with Holocaust denial in the middle of a classroom.
Oh,
Right?
wow.
And so a lot of my research kind of spanned that period of how the internet was being used by the far-right groups internationally during that period, and it's kind of grown off of that.
So can you give us a broad sense of what kinds of historical narratives or symbols far-right groups tend to latch on and why?
I think that a lot of it is using the past to legitimate their current ideas. So we oftentimes think of these far-right groups as sort of maybe manipulating history in some way. One of the classic examples that I've written about is the image of crusaders or
Yeah.
these types of images of that really had nothing to do with the world that we're living in today, but then they transpose those ideas into a modern version. So Burgos in Spain is a really good example of that. They've, for the last 30 years, had far-right groups um, pilgrimaging there every year to talk about El Cid, which is this medieval mercenary, for lack of a better word. He fought for whomever paid him the money to fight, right? But in their narrative, he is this person who fought against Muslim Spain, which it was just a mercenary. He was a mercenary who would fight whoever he was paid to fight. And so these sort of images get locked on to, well, this was a crusader who fought for us and fought for our nation, when really didn't think anything about uh, the world that we're living in today. And I think that you see this also with images of people like Joan of Arc. Um, in France, Marine Le Pen uses Joan of Arc's symbol every year as this sort of pilgrimage to a statue of her and gives a speech. And so it's all these sort of classical figures that people recognize, and they try to use those images of those people, those figures, to impose their own ideas through their narratives.
Yeah, I think in Spain it happens the same thing with Pelayo,
Sí, yeah.
who's an important figure of the Reconquista, or the reconquest of Spain by the Christians, or the so-called reconquest, and how the new far-right groups go every year to, or every time they start their electoral campaign, they do it from the statue of Pelayo in Asturias. So, but why do you think these medieval characters are so significant, or what do they provide?
I think what they provide is oftentimes they're legendary figures, right? Which means we don't actually have all the details about their lives. And so it's really easy to fill in the blanks using the national narratives that we have in the world today. So Joan of Arc wasn't thinking about France in the 21st century, but she was a person who was alive at one point, and we don't have a lot of um, we don't have a lot of knowledge about her everyday life or what her ideologies were, right? We just have these scattered reports that we kind of form a narrative around, and that's sort of what you end up with. And I think that a lot of these types of far-right groups see these images as indicative of their nation.
Okay. Yeah. No, I agree, 100%. So, what are exactly alt histories and alt history narratives, and why are they so popular?
I like to think of it as alternative histories are these alt timelines that never really happened, but it's sort of imagining a world where the past in some way was these random little facts that are facts, but then you piece them together in a way that isn't historical. And an alt history really is pulling apart these random bits of facts or myth, mixing them together, and then using that to justify the current day political ideologies of the far right.
Yeah. So it's a kind of fantasy.
It's
so
a
to speak.
fantasy. Yeah, it's an alternate reality that never really happened, but if you if you're an historian and you do the research, that's not the way that people live their lives or thought about themselves in the past. But it's a very familiar sort of trope to use these types of paths. Mussolini is another great example. He would always talk about Rome being the goal of the fascist movement, to bring back Rome, right? It's always this sort of call to a distant past. Franco in Spain was going back to the empire, the Spanish Empire in the Golden Age. So it's always this call back to an imagined past.
And for example, in the case of Trump, when he says "Make America Great Again," which past is he referring to?
And I think that's part of the question. That's one of the driving questions that I've always thought about is, what is this imagined past? Is it if for Trump, is it the 1950s when the world was segregated and women did not have equal rights? Is it what is this mythical past? Right.
I wonder the same
Right.
thing.
Is it the 19th century when you have slavery? Right. So when you talk about make America great again, or in Mussolini's case, make Italy Rome again,
Yeah.
whatever it is, that mythological past um, is somewhere in between the lines, right? It's not a past that actually existed. And is this really the past that you want to bring back?
Yeah.
If so,
Talking about these alt histories that you wrote in your recent edited volume, Far-Right Revisionism and the End of History, I was wondering, what do you mean by the end of history?
good question. You have good questions. Francis Fukuyama famously in the
Yeah.
90s wrote um, a book on the end of history and the last man.
Mhm.
And in that book, he actually, a lot of times scholars sort of derided him at the time
Yeah.
for his work, but he actually cites Donald Trump as the perfect example of the last man. And so he says in this book, published decades ago now,
Yeah, I know the book, but
yeah,
I
yeah,
didn't know that
yeah.
quote.
And he cites Donald Trump as being the example of this type of person who is going to not be content with the world that we live in and wants to restart history.
Wow.
And so the idea of the book was really to not just understand that movement,
Yeah.
but also parallel movements where these wannabe great men are trying to, in some way, use this um, narrative that we need to restart history, that things have gone awry.
Yeah.
And so the book is really about the end of history. So if we had this idea of history was ending and we were moving into the future, well, Fukuyama essentially said this is part of it, but then also you're going to have these megalomaniacs,
Yeah.
essentially,
Yeah.
who will try to make it about themselves and bring back some sort of imagined past. And so the book Alt Histories really is trying to think about how you manipulate and use history to create a world that never really existed, but saying that this was the way we once were.
Yeah, I mean, the book is fantastic, so I really recommend it. Um, Moving on, would you see a connection between the misuse of the medieval period or early modern history, like the Crusades that we spoke, or the Muslim rule over Iberia, and the narratives used by the far-right groups today?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's not just in Spain, but one of the most uh, one of the most poignant examples for me was I was looking at a generation identity
Yeah.
website several years ago now, and in it they had images of the Spanish reconquest
Mm.
and
Which
scare
images?
quotes.
I'm
Right,
curious.
right. It was imagined. It was an
Yeah.
it was just they found something on the internet and put it on there. I don't think it was even a
Yeah.
famous painting.
Yeah.
They just created something.
Mm.
But in the rhetoric, it was about reconquering um, Spain, or
Mm.
in some way. But then they took that and then applied it to understanding we need to reconquer Europe.
Yeah.
And so it was very much so. We need to cleanse Europe of people who are not of Europe,
Yeah.
and that was terrifying.
Yeah. Which is interesting to me when we look at these groups, because they seem to be quite nationalist,
Right,
but then they're quite pro-European.
right,
At the same time that this mixes with narratives, particularly in the 19th century, where it said that Europe started in the Pyrenees, kind of
hmm,
letting Spain as a
right,
mixed
right,
race
right.
country outside from Europe. So, what sense do we make of this new pro-European movement where Spain is included?
Right. Well, I think it actually shows how identity changes over time, right?
Okay, yeah.
So if we were in the 1900s, yes, there was this idea that Spain was different,
Yeah.
that was not quite European. But I think in a world that we've seen that developed over the last 100 plus years, um, Spain is a normal part of the European imagination. And I think that what we start to see is really kind of this shift from, uh, I think, way on the far right, they're not when they say Europe, what they're really saying is white nationalist,
Christian, well,
white Christian
yeah,
nationalist Europe,
yeah.
right? Like it is a white nationalist idea. They're not really thinking about Europe in the way that somebody who is thinking about the European Union
Yeah.
because in fact they're mostly against the European Union as a
Yeah.
concept. So they're thinking about a imagined white identity is a pure Europe that they want to recreate.
That they believe it existed at some point in history,
Right.
which we know it's not the case.
Right. Right.
But
Exactly.
they still, think that there was a moment in time, particularly medieval times,
Right. When everybody thought of themselves as white Europeans, but
Yeah.
they thought of themselves as from their town or city.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
what most
Yeah,
people
exactly.
identify that with.
Exactly. So, what are some examples where you've seen history reimagined or weaponized in especially dangerous or effective ways?
I mean, I think it's in the most. This is I think my interest in popular media is that it is so prevalent in popular media to see sort of imagine a film where you're looking at the depiction of the Renaissance or the Middle Ages,
Yeah.
and it's depicted as um, very homogenous, right?
Yeah.
Whereas the reality of it was you had people from all over the world coming in all over places, trading. Coffee was coming to Europe 500 years ago,
Yeah.
right? So it's not necessarily that suddenly these people were uh, different. We've had a world where people have moved constantly for centuries now, and I think that the images that we see where there was once this idea of a pure homogenous culture anywhere is really sort of the crux of all of these problems. You see it in video games, you see it in films, you see it in comic books.
Yeah.
And those types of images really kind of shape the ways that people think the past was
Yeah.
this more homogenous thing.
But I mean, arguably, maybe we can bring in the fantasy again, but in
Right,
the genre
right,
as being something that also has influenced people in believing that this kind of medieval inspired fantasy, as
right,
Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings,
right,
is how Europe was in the Middle
right.
Ages, with the every person with its community, and that's it,
Exactly.
and never kind of mingling.
Right, exactly. And that's, I think those types of images then become reinforced whenever somebody makes an argument. Well, we're having, um, in the far right circles, they'll call people invaders,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And this type of language calls back to the Crusades.
Yeah.
It calls back to different ways that people imagine the past being, and it makes that argument more um, palatable for a person today.
Yeah. Yeah, I see. So, can we talk a bit about nostalgia
Mm,
now? And this nostalgia again, this going back to this golden era or this imagined nationalist past, and how does it play into the far right messaging?
mm. Yeah, so I would say nostalgia. One There's this really great writer, Simon Reynolds, that writes
Yeah.
about nostalgia and pop culture's obsession with
He
it.
has the book of Retromania.
Yeah,
Is this one?
Retromania,
Yeah.
exactly. Yes, that's the one.
Yeah.
A great book,
Yeah.
and really, it's about sort of how pop culture makes references to the past, and it almost becomes memeified,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So you have these. That's why certain styles will come back, and really, what it does is it sort of takes the aesthetic of a past and then puts new meaning into it,
Mm.
but it confuses people often. And I think that's sort of what we're talking about here when we talk about nostalgia is somebody might look at a photo of their grandparents or their great grandparents, say, "Oh, life looks so much simpler and better back then." It's like, no, I mean, you probably didn't have vaccines and
Yeah.
antibiotics, right? Like,
Yeah.
you probably would not have lived as long as you think that you would. Life wasn't.
So it's romanticized
It's
again. Yeah.
romanticized.
Yeah.
And I think that's where a lot of these ideologies end up is with this romanticized ideology
Mm.
that is nostalgic in some way, but it's nostalgic again for something that never existed.
Yes. Yes.
Like
This fantasy.
it's fantasy.
So, how do you think people are really longing for when they embrace these kinds of distorted histories? Is it about identity or belonging or maybe fear?
I think it is. So the way I always try to describe far right ideologies, it's trying to figure out. Um, they have this idea of what the past was,
Mm.
and they're willing to purify the present in order to get back to that imagined past. So that could be attacking minority groups, they could be attacking the rights of certain people. It might even be going after architectural styles or aesthetics, whatever doesn't seem to fit with their idea of what the past was.
Yeah.
And so it's all tied to that.
So it's everything: identity, belonging, and fear.
Identity, belonging, fear, and if you don't fit into that pure vision of what it is, you go after the identity groups that don't match it. You are seeing maybe the world is maybe just take the average far right ideologue. The world is not what they expected it to be for them, and they're trying to find an excuse. And this is classic scapegoating. You see it in Nazi Germany, you see it in Italy, you see it in Spain, right? This idea of, well, what we want for our country or for ourselves isn't actually happening. And so they try to find a way to have a scapegoat for that.
And also, would you say that it's a way of getting power?
Absolutely.
It's an easy way to getting into, I mean, maybe I'm being a bit cynical, but especially the ones who are leading these political parties or this movement, not necessarily the ones who are supporting it.
Oh yeah, I think it's about, it's simultaneously both things, right? It's people in these parties who they want power for themselves, and they see that if they scapegoat X group, they're going to propose that as the solution. So that's how you get this anti-immigrant tinge to a lot of these types of things. It's the immigrants are taking our jobs. Well, no, they're just working and living life, and you can probably have enough jobs for everybody. Right? That's how economies usually work. But it's trying to find a scapegoat, and that's where political power comes from, solving people's problems.
So how can historians, educators, or even a podcast like this one push back against the misuse of history without just preaching to the choir?
I think it's a question that is not just about correcting, right? So a lot of times people think, well, we just need to show them what the real history is. No,
We know that doesn't work
that
anyway.
doesn't work, right? And I think really what it comes down to is teaching people critical thinking skills to be able to ask those questions themselves. So if somebody makes a claim, well, what is the evidence? Where do you find that? Where does this image come from? How did people actually live? And so it's really about teaching people to interrogate things themselves rather than sort of this, no, that's not correct. This is not right. It's not always the corrective. It's the teaching people to do it themselves.
Actually, I think part of our project is not really righting the wrongs, because we're not necessarily coming to the study of how history is rewritten from this kind of corrective aim, but more to understand how the processes and what happens and the consequences of it. What gives you hope in terms of how we're learning to engage more critically with the past, especially in this time of misinformation and rising extremism?
I often think about sort of technology as sort of this really important question generally. So in the late 19th century rather, you had all these new newspapers coming on board, and you would have, any given city would have dozens of newspapers, if not more. And for the average person, that was information overload, right? Right? And you get this yellow and pink journalism of the time that's sensationalist and oftentimes trying to provoke readers. And I think if you just take that concept, we're still dealing with that, but now in a digital era where there's even more inundation and also more, it's harder for people to discern information, right? And so I think that what we're trying to deal with is really get people to learn how to better um, find relatively, we'll say, trustworthy sources. How do you learn how to not believe everything that's thrown at you on the internet? And how do you give people those skills?
Which is getting harder with
It's
the
harder.
deep fakes,
Right, with deep
the
fakes
development of AI.
It's like, is this a real image? Is this a real video? All of these things are factors, right? And I think that what we're going to have really happen is people learning how to have media savvy, be able to understand, well, what do you look for whenever these things are popping up?
It's hard to convince universities that the important thing is to think critically and not just learn skills.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's I always one of the ways I always describe it is AI is actually really good at just like counting things.
Right.
Right. So
Right.
that's a skill.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know
Yeah.
if then maybe we should think about, well, what is AI not able to do?
Yeah.
Right. AI is not able to think critically.
Yeah.
And
100%.
that's
Yeah.
something that a human being only can do.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, what we need to do is make sure people are thinking critically, not just about these their news sources, but also what's happening in the world. How does it affect them? I think a lot of times people feel disempowered on the local level,
Yeah.
and that's really where these far right ideologies latch onto.
Yeah.
Is if you feel disempowered as an individual, you're trying to find a reason for that.
Exactly.
And so we need
Yeah.
to better understand that at its core.
Yeah. So just to finalize, I have two questions.
Yeah.
One would be if you had to recommend one idea or lesson from your research to a general audience, what would it be?
So I think that a lot of it for me is uh, a lot of times people are afraid to use the word fascism because they don't understand what it is. And I think understanding what that is really starts with, well, who is being attacked?
Okay.
So if you look at sort of the classic cases of fascism, in Nazi Germany, it was disabled people, it was queer people, it was people of color, it was immigrants, it was Jewish people, it was intellectuals, it was a whole gamut of um, Roma people. I mean,
Yeah.
you go down the
Yeah.
list, right? And when you start to think about that as sort of the case study, it's not looking for like a dictatorship. It's looking for rationales that people use to attack minority groups. And that really is at the core of understanding fascism.
Yeah.
And if you understand that as fascism, then anytime people are coming for these minority groups, in whatever context we're talking about, that is a version of fascism in a given context.
And the final question, so what do you hope people take away from studying the past in today's world?
That the past in today's world isn't just about trying to figure out cause and effect. So, um, Franz Ferdinand is shot in World War One, and that leads to World War One. Well, that's part of what leads to World War One. It's not just a singular event. That I think all these things are sort of intermingled in a way that is much more complicated than we typically teach in primary, secondary school. And
I know.
and yeah, and I think like that's really kind of the challenge for people is learning how to be able to discern the past is part of what affects our present, but also the past is something that um, creates our anxieties, right? And those anxieties are what we're still dealing with culturally, socially, and maybe we need to be able to figure that out to be able to deal with um, the future.
Okay.
So history is more than just things that happened in the past.
Okay. Well, thank you very much
Yeah.
for coming to our podcast, Louie.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's great.
So now we are joined by one of our team members at Digital Al-Andalus, Irene, who's bringing today's lightning round.
Thank you, Cristina. Hi, Louis. I'm going to say some statements, and you will need to guess if these quotes were said by a filmmaker or a far-right politician.
Okay, let's do it.
Number one, they asked for medicine and they were given morphine. Far-right politician or filmmaker?
Filmmaker?
This sentence was said by Santiago Abascal, the leader of the Spanish far-right party Vox, during the vote of no confidence against the Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez in 2020. Another chance.
Okay.
Number two, I was born in a bad time for Spain.
Oh, that could be anybody. Let's say filmmaker this time. No?
Yes.
Yes,
This was
okay.
Who
Which
said it?
filmmaker? Who said it?
Pedro Almodóvar
Yes,
said it in an interview in 2006.
that makes sense.
Number 3. The Catholics will never like me because of my divorces.
That would be, I would say, a politician.
So this quote has been attributed to the French National Rally leader Marine Le Pen.
Yep.
Did you know?
I've heard her say things like that.
Number 4. Violence is one of the most fun things to watch.
Filmmaker.
Can you guess?
Oh geez. Amenábar? I don't know.
Amenábar.
No, this was said by Quentin Tarantino.
Oh. That makes
makes
sense a
sense,
lot
right?
with him.
Number 5. I believe there is something out there watching us. Unfortunately, it's the government.
That sounds like a politician.
So this quote is commonly attributed to Woody Allen,
Oh,
the
really?
American filmmaker.
Yes. I don't think the government's watching him that much.
Number 6. I have a very good brain and I have said a lot of things. I am like a really smart person.
That sounds like Donald Trump.
Is it?
Yes.
Yeah, that was easy.
That one was easy.
Number 7. I talk to my dead dog Conan through a medium.
That sounds like a filmmaker.
Actually,
No?
that's Argentinian President Milei.
Oh, that's Milei.
He claims to consult with his deceased dog for advice.
That checks out also.
Yes. Now we know.
Now we know.
Number 8. You don't care whether it's Juana or her sister.
That sounds like a filmmaker.
Again,
No.
that was said by Santiago Abascal,
Uh-huh.
leader of the Spanish
Oh.
far-right party Vox. Number 9. Except for drinking, everything feels so hard for me.
Is that French? These could be idiot like politicians
True.
or I'll just randomly guess filmmaker.
Yes, so this
Yes.
is part of Almodóvar's film, The Flower of My
Oh.
Secret.
That's a great movie.
Yep.
Yep.
And then we get to the last one. I don't like films that come to get on our nerves and make movies just to make us feel bad.
That sounds like a politician.
Yes, so
Yep.
again, this quote was said by Santiago Abascal.
Yep.
Okay.
2020.
That brings us to the end of today's podcast. Please check the work of our experts in the episode notes. And to learn more about the Digital Al-Andalus project, please visit our website. Thank you for joining us on the Digital Al-Andalus on the record. Until next time, remember, the past isn't dead, it's just being redrafted.